The lock clicked from the outside. Amira Whitfield heard it and didn't even turn around. She already knew what it meant. Her stepmother's voice was still fading down the corridor above her, light and pleased with itself. "It's just until the toasts are done, sweetheart. We can't have you wandering around looking like that." Looking like what? Amira hadn't bothered to ask. She knew the answer already. Looking like the daughter nobody had invited to be seen. The room she was in wasn't even a room, not really. It was a service corridor behind the hotel's grand ballroom, concrete floor, one bare bulb, a folding table someone had left down there for staff breaks. Through the wall she could hear the band starting the first dance. Somewhere above her, 200 guests were watching her half-sister spin slowly in $8,000 of French lace. Amira sat down at the folding table, opened her laptop, and got back to work, because someone had to keep the numbers straight tonight, and it certainly wasn't going to be anyone upstairs. The corridor had the particular quality of spaces that exist only in the margins of other people's important nights, not forgotten exactly, just never quite included. A pipe ticked somewhere overhead as it cooled. The fluorescent tube above the folding table flickered faintly, the kind of flicker you only notice once everything else has gone silent. Amira had brought nothing down here except her clutch and her laptop bag, because she hadn't planned on being sent here. She'd simply come down for air, for 5 quiet minutes before the toasts. And Diane had turned the lock on her way back up. That was where he found her, not a waiter, not a hotel employee checking on the breaker box. A man in a black tuxedo with no tie, standing in the doorway like he'd expected to find exactly this, and was still, somehow, not quite prepared for it. He looked at the locked door behind him, then at her, then at the laptop glowing in the dark. Later, she would learn that this was simply how Yiwon Lee moved through a room, cataloging what didn't add up before anyone had said a word. A name card flipped face down. An empty chair nobody mentioned. A door locked from a hallway that had no obvious reason to be locked at all. 11 years of untangling his own father's business affairs had trained him to notice exactly the details everyone else had been trained to walk past. "That door was locked from the outside," he said. "It wasn't a question." "I know," Amira said. "I was there for the part where someone turned the key." He didn't laugh. He didn't look sorry for her either, which she appreciated more than she expected to. He just walked in, pulled out the folding chair across from her, and sat down like he'd been invited. "I'm Yiwon," he said. "I'm the best man." Amira looked at him for a long moment. The bow tie he wasn't wearing, the watch that cost more than her rent. The particular stillness of someone used to being the most important person in every room he entered, and choosing, right now, not to be. "Well, Yiwon," she said. "Welcome to the basement. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments where you're watching this from and what time it is right where you are. I want to know who's here with me tonight. And if you're new to this channel, hit subscribe, because what happens between Amira and Yiwon in the next 20 minutes is going to stay with you long after the video ends. Stay with me. This is Amira Whitfield's story. Her name was Amira Whitfield, 30 years old, Senior Trust Administrator at Whitfield Family Holdings, a position her late father had built specifically for her. Though nobody upstairs tonight would have described her that way. Tonight on the guest list on the seating chart, in the toast her stepmother had rehearsed twice in the mirror, she was simply Bridget's sister, older, quieter, the one who never married. Her mother had died when Amira was 11, an aggressive cancer, diagnosed in March, gone by June. What Amira remembered wasn't the hospital room or the funeral flowers. It was her father 3 days later, standing at the kitchen counter with a mug of coffee he'd made and never touched, staring at nothing. She had been 11 years old, and she had walked over, poured the cold coffee down the drain, and made a fresh pot without being asked. She had been doing some version of that for 19 years. Her father remarried when Amira was 13. Diane was polished, capable, and generous with her attention in the specific way of someone keeping a ledger. When Bridget was born 2 years later, the household rearranged itself without anyone announcing it out loud. Amira became the responsible one, the one who understood. The one who didn't need looking after, because she had already decided quietly, at 13, that needing things was a request that wouldn't be granted, so there was no use making it. "You're so steady," Diane used to say, in the tone people use for compliments that are actually instructions. It wasn't praise, it was an assignment. When Amira was 16, her father sat across from her at the kitchen table one evening after dinner. The dishes were done. Bridget was upstairs. Diane's voice carried faintly through the wall, on the phone with her sister, the way it always did. The kitchen had gone quiet in the specific way that meant whatever came next was meant for Amira alone. "You're older," her father said. "You understand things Bridget and Diane just aren't ready for yet." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "You can carry a little more for a while longer, can't you?" She nodded without hesitating. Not because it felt fine, because being asked, being singled out, being trusted with something, felt close enough to being loved that at 16 she couldn't yet tell the two apart. Being needed by her father in that kitchen was the nearest thing to "I love you" she'd learned how to receive. There's a term for what happens to a child in a family like that. Parentification, the slow transfer of adult emotional and practical labor onto a child long before they're equipped to carry it. It doesn't happen all at once. It accumulates the way sediment does, quietly, until one day the whole landscape has shifted and you can't quite remember what the ground used to look like underneath it. And because it arrives wrapped in so much apparent love, it doesn't register as a burden, it registers as an identity. Amira found the word itself in a psychology elective her second year of college, taken to fill a gap in her schedule. She read the definition once, then again, then a third time slowly, the way you read something describing you with a precision that feels almost impolite. Then she closed the textbook and didn't open it to that page again. Some things, once named, become too heavy to keep looking at directly. You don't put them down, you just stop staring. You keep walking, you keep working, you keep holding things together, because you've been holding them together for so long that holding has become indistinguishable from simply existing. 4 years ago, on a Thursday morning, Amira's phone rang before 6 a.m. Her father had collapsed at his desk. She was the one who drove to the hospital. She was the one who sat in the corridor with the estate documents he'd asked her to prepare 6 months earlier. Just in case, while Diane and Bridget held each other in the family waiting room down the hall. Nobody came to check on her. Nobody thought to. Amira was always fine. Amira didn't need anything. That had been decided a long time ago by people who had never once asked her if it was true. 6 weeks before Bridget's wedding, the call came at 11 p.m. Amira was already in bed. She picked up anyway, because she always picked up. "Kai, I need to ask you something," Bridget said, using the old childhood nickname she only reached for when she wanted something large. The venue deposit had fallen through. The trust disbursement wouldn't clear in time. Nathan's parents had already contributed their share, and Bridget didn't want to ask them for more. "I'll handle it," Amira said. She hung up, opened her banking app, and sat there for a long moment with a second tab open beside it. A flight to Lisbon she had priced out and almost bought 3 separate times over 2 years. Cancelled each time for reasons that, in retrospect, weren't really reasons at all. Just the old habit of coming last in her own life, worn so smooth by repetition it no longer felt like a choice. She closed the Lisbon tab. She wired $92,000 to the venue's account at 11:40 p.m. and went to sleep. The next morning, Bridget texted, "Thank you, Kai." Venues confirmed she never asked where the money came from. Amira looked at the message for a few seconds, set the phone face down, and opened her laptop to the trust files instead. An hour before the ceremony, Amira had stood in the bridal suite adjusting Bridget's veil for the 3rd time. The first 2 adjustments hadn't been wrong. Bridget simply hadn't been satisfied yet. When it was finally right, Bridget studied herself in the mirror, said "okay," and walked out without a glance back. Amira stood alone with her hands still lifted, in the shape of holding something that was no longer there. The vows Bridget read that afternoon, the ones that made the whole room go quiet, the ones Nathan had to blink hard through, Amira had rewritten them from scratch at midnight. Because Bridget had texted, "Can you just punch mine up a little? They sound so generic." Amira hadn't punched them up. She had rebuilt them, word by word, and placed the line she knew would catch Bridget's voice exactly where it needed to sit. Nobody in that ballroom knew that. Nobody was supposed to. At the entrance, Diane had stood with a printed seating chart and an expression of arithmetic rather than warmth. "We needed the room upstairs for the guests who traveled in," she'd said, smooth as a rehearsed line, and directed Amira toward the service stairwell instead. 4 steps away, Bridget was laughing with a guest, veil catching the light, and if she heard, she didn't turn around. That was how Amira ended up in a locked service corridor with a folding table and a dead laptop battery, while 200 people upstairs celebrated a wedding she had quietly paid for a third of. That was where Yiwon Lee found her. He didn't say "I'm sorry" or "that's terrible," the kind of well-meaning sentence that, however gently it's offered, tells you that you're being observed rather than heard. He just sat there across the folding table in the half-dark, hands loosely folded, watching her with an attention that had no calculation underneath it, no next move being planned. No impression being managed, just looking, the way you look at something you've decided is worth looking at. "Nathan mentioned you," Yiwon said after a moment. "The sister who runs everything and never takes credit for it. I thought he was exaggerating." "He wasn't exaggerating," Amira said. "He was just being polite about the part where I got locked in a basement." Something crossed Yiwon's face that wasn't quite a smile, but was close enough to count. "That part I saw for myself." She studied him properly for the first time, late 30s, maybe 40, the kind of composure that isn't taught, only inherited or forged. She knew, in a vague way, that most people in her professional world knew. The name Lee Capital Partners, the Seoul-based investment group that had quietly bought up half the commercial waterfront in 3 American cities over the past decade. She hadn't put together until just now that the best man at her sister's wedding and the man behind that name were the same person. "You're that Yiwon Lee," she said, not a question. A recognition settling into place. "I am," he said. "And you're the Whitfield who's been managing your father's trust since before most people your age had learned to read a balance sheet." Amira went still. "How do you know that?" He didn't answer right away. What he didn't say, what he hadn't yet decided how to say, was this. 3 years earlier, going through the wreckage of a business dispute his own father had left behind. Yiwon's legal team had turned up a decades-old land parcel in the Pacific Northwest, tied to a holding company that traced, after 4 connected filings, back to something called the Whitfield Family Trust. He'd flagged it, found a deceased founder named Robert Whitfield, found a sole trust administrator listed on the most recent filing, Amira A. Whitfield. He had noted the name for follow-up, and then Nathan had announced his engagement, and Yiwon had agreed to be best man to a friend he genuinely liked, while quietly carrying a second. Unspoken reason for being in this city at all. He had walked into that basement corridor tonight to find the woman managing the Whitfield Trust and determine, face to face, whether an old transaction was a loose thread that needed pulling. Then she told him to welcome to the basement, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he had forgotten, entirely, what he'd come here to find. "I did some background before the wedding," he said instead, which was true, just incomplete. Standard practice when you're standing up for a friend's marriage into a family you don't know well. Amira narrowed her eyes slightly, filing that answer away as true, but not finished. The way she filed away every incomplete sentence anyone had ever handed her, at a negotiating table. That's a very careful non-answer for a man who just walked into a locked basement to check on a stranger. "You're not a stranger," Yiwon said. "You're the reason there's a wedding upstairs at all." Footsteps sounded in the corridor above, even, unhurried. The specific rhythm Amira had spent 30 years learning to recognize before Diane ever came into view. Amira closed her laptop and stood, and Yiwon rose with her, without being asked, the way people do when they've already decided which side of a room they're standing on. Diane appeared at the top of the service stairwell, with 2 women Amira didn't recognize, champagne-flushed guests looking for something interesting to witness. Diane's smile arrived a half-second before her eyes did. "Amira, still down here," a small laugh shared with the women, as if Amira weren't standing 3 feet away. "Everyone, this is Bridget's older sister. She's always preferred to keep to herself. We used to joke she was born 40, polite laughter. The exact right length to let the insult land and pass before anyone had to acknowledge it as one. Amira didn't raise her voice. She didn't rush. She closed her laptop, set the cold coffee cup she'd been nursing since 6 p.m. carefully on the folding table, and straightened the chair behind her with the same unhurried economy she brought to everything that actually mattered to her. "Congratulations on the wedding," she said, looking directly at Diane. "Not your wedding, not Bridget's wedding. Just the wedding," a small, precise grammatical choice that only someone paying very close attention would have caught. Yiwon caught it. He didn't say anything to Diane. He didn't glance at the two women beside her. He simply fell into step 3 paces behind Amira as she walked toward the stairs, not close enough to be mistaken for an escort, not far enough that she wouldn't feel, without turning around, that the space behind her wasn't empty. That was the thing he understood about her within the first 10 minutes of sitting across a folding table in the dark. Amira Whitfield did not need anyone to rescue her. She had never once needed rescuing. What she needed, what it seemed nobody in her life had thought to offer in 19 years, was a witness. Someone to stand in the room and confirm, simply by being present, that what had just happened to her was real. He could do that, so he did. If this story is landing for you so far, do me a favor and drop a like. It genuinely helps this video reach more people who need to hear it. And if you've ever been the one holding a family together while everyone else got to fall apart in peace, tell me in the comments. I read every single one of them. Now let's get back to Amira. The valets stand outside the hotel, smelled of rain on warm pavement and distant salt air. Amira walked past the attendants, past the guests filtering out for phone calls and cigarettes, to the far end of the drop-off lane and called her assistant. "Danny, it's almost 10, he answered. "I know, first thing Monday. I need you to pull every trust disbursement Diane's authorized in the last 18 months. Cross-reference against the original trust instrument. I'm filing a formal audit hold on the estate first thing tomorrow." A pause on the line. "Is everything? I'll have the paperwork to you by 7 a.m. She ended the call and stood in the warm dark, the distant party still humming faintly through the hotel's brick walls. Footsteps behind her, she didn't turn. "Need a ride?" Yiwon asked. "Not are you okay? Not I'm so sorry about tonight." Just the most practical question available, the kind that assumes you're a person with a destination, not a person who needs to be managed. "Yes," Amira said, and got in the car. They drove in silence for the first several minutes, past glass towers reflecting streetlights on wet asphalt, past the dark water of the bay opening briefly between buildings. Somewhere around the 7th minute, without planning to, Amira heard herself say it out loud. "I paid for a third of that wedding." Yiwon didn't answer right away. He let the sentence sit in the car the way you let an important fact sit, rather than rushing to cover it. $92,000, Amira continued. "I negotiated the catering contract because Bridget's first choice had a liability clause that would have bankrupted them if anyone canceled. I rewrote the vows at midnight because the draft she sent me sounded like a template, because it was a template." She paused. "I don't know why I'm telling you this, because I'm the first person tonight who sat down next to you and didn't want something from you," Yiwon said. She looked at him. It was, she realized, possibly the truest sentence anyone had said to her in years, and true sentences, when you've gone without them long enough, don't feel like relief. They feel like a door opening in a wall you'd stopped believing had a door in it at all. At a red light on 4th Avenue, Yiwon spoke again, quieter this time. "My father left me 3 companies and a list of people who felt owed something," he said. "Everyone told me I should be grateful. Grateful for a structure someone else built, so long as I never touched the load-bearing walls." The light changed. He eased the car forward. "I've spent 6 years balancing other people's ledgers. I don't think I've ever built anything I actually wanted to exist. We're the same in that," Amira said quietly. Not with sorrow, with the strange, specific relief of finding, in an unexpected place, the exact shape of a thing she'd assumed only she was carrying. He said nothing. But his hands loosened slightly on the wheel, a change so small she wouldn't have noticed it if she hadn't already been watching. His phone lit up on the console. "Nathan, we need to talk, I know." He glanced at it, typed a short reply without slowing the car, and set it face down again. "He knew something was wrong tonight," Amira said, not a question. "Nathan knows most things," Yiwon said. "He just chooses, sometimes, not to look directly at them. That's a careful way of saying he let it happen." "It is," Yiwon agreed. "He's going to have to decide what he does with that." They pulled up outside her building a few minutes later. The lobby light was on. The street had gone quiet the way residential blocks do after 9. Amira had her hand on the door handle when she turned back. "You knew I administered the trust before you walked into that basement," she said, a measured pause. "Yes, and the land parcel, your father's old filings. Also yes," she held his gaze. "So you came looking for the estate." "I came looking for the estate," Yiwon said. "I stayed for the person running it." She got out of the car. She didn't look back, but walking toward her lobby in the cool night air, something in her chest shifted, small, specific, the sensation of a thing braced for a very long time releasing carefully. Exactly 1 degree of tension. Inside, she sat at her kitchen table at 11:20 p.m. and opened the estate portal, formal audit petition, supporting exhibits, preliminary review request. Her hands moved without hesitation. This was her language, spoken fluently and without apology. She filed at 11:58 p.m. It wasn't revenge. Revenge requires the other person to occupy your mind while you act, and Diane hadn't occupied Amira's mind in years. Not really. Amira had simply stopped fighting the current long enough to notice which direction it had always been pulling her. What she filed that night was a professional obligation any administrator would be expected to exercise, the kind every trust administrator in families like hers is quietly, endlessly discouraged from exercising. She had simply stopped being discouraged. She opened a second tab, flight to Lisbon, direct, departing in January. This time she didn't close it. She bought the ticket, closed the laptop, and went to bed. The audit took 7 weeks, standard timeline for a trust review of that scale in Washington state. The examiner assigned was a woman named Carol Petrosian, 26 years with the state's Fiduciary Oversight Division. With the specific patience of someone who had learned long ago that the important numbers are never in the column anyone points you toward first. She found $81,000 in disbursements over 18 months, authorized by Diane, filed under estate administration fees. No invoices attached to any of them. No services rendered that matched the category. Carol filed her findings on a Tuesday. The state's follow-up review opened that Thursday. Diane received certified notification the following Saturday morning, the kind of envelope that sits on a porch step until someone finally comes to sign for it. 3 months after the wedding, Diane called. Amira was at her desk reviewing a title transfer when the name lit up her screen. She let it ring twice before answering. "Amira, sweetheart," Diane said, smooth and unbothered, as if the intervening months had been an unfortunate misunderstanding rather than a consequence. "We really should sit down and finalize the last of the estate paperwork. There are a few signatures still outstanding, and Bridget's been looking at a house in." Amira ended the call. No explanation, no parting line chosen for maximum effect. She simply stopped, set the phone face down on her desk, and went back to the title transfer in front of her, her pen moving steady and unhurried across the signature line. Bridget called 7 weeks later on a Tuesday evening, while Amira was cooking dinner. She answered on the second ring. Silence on the other end, not a hostile silence, not a calculating one. The silence of someone who had rehearsed an apology long enough that the words had worn smooth and lost their grip. "I know," Amira said gently, before Bridget could find them again. "You don't have to say it tonight." She ended the call and stood at the stove a moment without moving, the burner low beneath a pot she realized she'd been tending on low heat for years. Always adjusting, never letting it come to a full boil. She turned it up. It wasn't forgiveness. Forgiveness has its own timeline, its own architecture, and Amira had learned enough by now about building things properly to know that structures raised in haste rarely hold weight. What she'd offered Bridget was something smaller and, in its way, more useful, the information that the door existed and that it was unlocked. What Bridget chose to do with that was hers to carry. Amira had plenty of her own. Whitfield Legal and Fiduciary Advisory opened on the 11th floor of a glass building 2 blocks from the county courthouse the following February. Clean black letters on brushed steel, her name first, not Whitfield Family Holdings, the structure she'd inherited and maintained for 19 years without ever once choosing it. Just her name on a door she'd chosen to open herself. The practice specialized in protecting overlooked heirs, the people who'd spent years managing family assets only to discover, at the moment of distribution, that the structure they'd maintained had been quietly built against them. Amira knew exactly what those clients looked like when they walked in, the particular way they held their folders slightly too tight. The grip of someone who'd learned the hard way that paperwork was the only language certain rooms would listen to. She'd been one of them. Now she held the pen. Yuan Li walked into her office on a Wednesday afternoon in March, 4 months and 11 days after the wedding. No appointment. Danny looked up from the front desk with the particular expression reserved for walk-ins who hadn't read the website. Do you have? No, Yiwon said pleasantly. Is she in? Amira appeared in her doorway, having heard the voice through the glass partition the same way she'd once heard footsteps on a service stairwell. Some acoustics you carry with you. She leaned against the frame, arms crossed. You don't have an appointment. Lee Capital has 14 attorneys across 3 offices, Yiwon said. This isn't for Lee Capital. He set a thin, cream-colored folder on Danny's desk. It's personal, my father's holdings, some transactions that were never properly resolved. I wanted them reviewed by someone I trust. You could trust any attorney in this city. I could, Yiwon said. But I came here. His gaze moved past her, through the open door to the window behind her desk and the sign on the wall beside it. Whitfield Legal and Fiduciary Advisory. Her name, her building. Her afternoon light. I wanted to see, he said, if you'd actually built it. You did, Amira said. She held his gaze a moment, then stepped back and gestured him inside. Danny pushed my 3 o'clock. The meeting ran 40 minutes. The estate matter was real. She'd half expected a folder full of pretext, and found instead a genuinely complicated property transfer his father had started and never finished. She gave him a straight answer. Her job ended when the meeting did. She walked him to the door. He paused there, hand on the handle, the same deliberate stillness she'd already learned to recognize as the moment before he said something he'd already decided to say. Are you free Thursday? A brief pause. Not as my attorney. She looked at him, the man who had sat down across from her at a folding table without asking permission, who had followed her up a service stairwell and stood 3 steps behind and said nothing, because he understood, with a precision she still wasn't fully used to, that what she needed was never rescue. Who had driven her home through the wet city dark and told her something true about his own life in the same careful voice she used when telling the truth about hers. Thursday, she said. He nodded, no performance of satisfaction, just something small and real at the corner of his mouth. The expression of a man who'd been carrying a question for 4 months and had finally gotten his answer. The door closed. Amira stood at the window a while, watching the late light turn the water to hammered bronze, the ordinary, unbothered persistence of a city going about its business without requiring anything from her. She picked up her phone and opened her calendar. Thursday, 7 p.m. Yiwon, not as counsel. Her thumb hovered a moment, then added one more line beneath it, smaller for no audience but herself. First thing on this calendar that belongs only to me. Thursday came. He picked her up at 7, no car service this time, driving himself, and took her to a small place on the waterfront with exactly 6 tables and no sign out front. The kind of restaurant you only find if someone who already knows it takes you there. They didn't talk about the trust. They didn't talk about Lee Capital or Whitfield Holdings or audits or folders. He asked her what she'd wanted to be before she became the person who held everything together, and she had to sit with the question a long moment before she found an honest answer. A landscape architect, she said finally, surprised at herself. I used to redraw our backyard in a notebook when I was 12. I don't think I've thought about that in 18 years. What stopped you? Nobody stopped me, Amira said. I just noticed eventually that nobody was going to ask me what I wanted, so I stopped answering the question, even to myself. Yiwon was quiet for a moment, turning his glass slowly on the table. I used to want to build something with my own name on it that had nothing to do with my father's companies, he said, a small fund. Something that only backed people, rebuilding after they'd been pushed out of their own family businesses. I never told anyone that. Why not? Because saying it out loud made it a thing I could fail at instead of a thing I could keep almost doing forever. Amira looked at him for a long moment. I bought a plane ticket to Lisbon in January, she said. I've canceled that same flight twice in 3 years. This time I didn't. Good, he said, and there was nothing performative in it, just the plain, solid weight of the word. They stayed until the restaurant's last table besides theirs had emptied, and when he walked her to her door that night, he didn't ask to come up, and she didn't invite him. And neither of those things felt like an ending. It felt instead like 2 people who had finally stopped rushing toward anything, content for once, to let something take exactly as long as it needed to. She thought about the folding table in that basement, the cold coffee, the Lisbon tab she'd finally left open long enough to become a boarding pass instead of a closed browser window. She thought about what it felt like to file an audit hold at 11:58 on a Friday night and know, without needing anyone to confirm it for her, that she'd done the right thing. And she thought about the thing Diane had never understood, and Bridget was only just beginning to. The thing her own father, in his love for her and his failure to protect her, had never fully understood either. The people who rely on you, not knowing your own worth, will keep the arrangement running for exactly as long as you let them. The moment you finally see the price they've quietly put on you and refuse to keep paying it yourself, the arrangement ends, not with a scene, not with shouting. Just a woman in a glass office in the late afternoon, watching the light change, in no hurry, going nowhere she hadn't chosen, answering to no one but herself, finally entirely hers. So tell me what stayed with you. Was it the locked door, the Lisbon tab she almost didn't buy, or the 4 minutes of silence in that basement with a man who sat down and wanted nothing from her? Drop it in the comments. I read every one of them. And if you've ever been the person holding everything together while your name card got quietly turned face down, tell me that too, because that's exactly why this channel exists. If this story meant something to you tonight, hit like, subscribe if you're new here, and share it with the one person you know who needs to hear how this ends, because somewhere out there, right now, someone is sitting in a basement of their own. And she deserves to know it doesn't end there.